Good morning, and happy Mother's Day to all of you that applies to. This morning, as it's almost the obligation of a preacher to speak about mothers on Mother's Day, we will be taking a look at a mother in the Bible. But it's one that we probably hardly recognize as being a mother in the first place, and yet there are some things that we can recognize about motherhood from this individual. And also, unintentionally, will help us to appreciate the complementary nature of the Gospels. That is, that sometimes you have to look at two to get the full story of what's going on. So we'll see that as well, and we'll try to harmonize the story. Particularly, this will be between the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 7, but then also in Matthew chapter 15, that tells of the same account. And we'll look at both of those if you want to kind of keep both of those open or one of those marked. So, to start out with, we have to give a little bit of background, as we always want to when we are looking at a part of Scripture. In this case, this is in Jesus' earthly ministry, of course, in the Gospels, but it sets up the story in a particular location as well. So in Mark chapter 7, verse 24, it says, "From there he arose and he went to the region of Tyre and Sidon." Well, where is that exactly? Basically, it's north of Israel. Even modern day Israel would be just a little bit north of that location, so it would be in Lebanon now, but at that time, it was just north of Israel. Now, historically, Tyre and Sidon, they weren't always a united kingdom, but for a lot of history they were, and they functioned as two of the greatest port cities in that area, and so that made them quite wealthy and made them quite powerful as well. But in the Bible, they are noticeable for a couple of reasons. One, they are the northern boundary of what would have been Israel, even at its greatest extent. But two, they were actually considered Canaanite and part of the land of Canaan, even though they were never conquered. And so we'll pick back up with that idea in just a minute when we talk about this individual that we're going to look at. One other thing we want to say, if you back up a little bit in the book of Mark, is that this region was not immune to hearing about Christ. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 7, it says, "But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea, and Jerusalem, and Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, and those from Tyre and Sidon." Okay, so far before this story ever takes place, the people of this area have heard about Christ, to the point that some of them are even coming to him already. And so it shouldn't be any shock to us when we find this woman that we're going to encounter having some knowledge about Jesus, because evidently that had already happened. Now, the same thing is happening in this story as was happening back in Mark chapter 3. It says there he withdrew to the Sea of Galilee. Here he withdraws to this region, even outside of Israel. Why does he do that? Well, it pretty well tells us in the text. It says he entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. So he goes into a specific house in a not far away country, but an out-of-the-way place, and people still won't leave him alone. But he wants that. So there seems to be, in both of these cases, there seems to be an idea with Christ that he needs a little bit of time to himself. Now, I don't think that's the part of him that's God, but I think that's the part of him that's like us, isn't it? Even from doing the work of God, occasionally you're going to have to step back for a minute and say, okay. Can you imagine the weight of being Christ for just a minute? Can you imagine what it's like to be the Son of God on earth, knowing how you're going to die, knowing that you have to teach a nation that's going to reject you over and over again? And so on occasion, he goes away from that. But he can't quite get away here. Because what happens after he goes into this house, in verse 25 of Mark 7, it says that a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. So here we are introduced to this woman. Most often, I think, she's referred to as the Syrophoenician woman. What a great description. Pretty literal, at least. She's a woman and she's from a certain place. But what we want to emphasize is that we know a little bit more about her, if nothing else, that she is not just a woman from Syrophoenicia, she's a mother from Syrophoenicia. And she's a mother in need, because her daughter is possessed by a demon. Now today there's some pretty wicked things that can overtake people. There's some pretty bad diseases that can afflict people today. But this child was possessed by a demon. That is, a worker of Satan has come into her and is influencing her to do wickedness. What would you do if that's your child? And so this mother comes to Christ because she thinks that he can help. So that's what she's going to do. But the other things that we find out about her. For one, in Matthew's account, Matthew 15, verse 22, it adds that she calls out to him saying, "O Lord, Son of David." Like we said before, she knows a little bit about who this person is, not just some of the lies that the Jews believe even, but she really knows that he is the Son of David. The Son of David, meaning that he is the Messiah, recognizing him as that part of that lineage. The text calls her various things. It calls her, in Matthew's account, it says that she's of Canaan. Now, like we said, that's technically true, in that she is part of that original promised land of Canaan, and so historically she would have been a Canaanite. But it also says that she is a Greek in Mark's account in verse 26. So is she a Greek? Well, in the sense that she's not Jewish, yes, she's Greek, even though she's not from Greece. And then also it says that she is a Syrophoenician by birth. So when we say a Syrophoenician, that's referring more to the general region that she's from, especially in Roman times. She's from the area of Syria and Phoenicia. That's how they get that compound word, and that is transliterated from the original language. But basically all of these descriptions of her are true, even though they talk about different places. She is from all of those places at once. And it says of her in Mark's account, unlike in Luke's, but in Mark's account in verse 26, it says that she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Again, if this is your daughter, what do you do? If this is your child that is being possessed by a demon and someone doesn't respond, someone says no the first time, what do you do next? You keep asking, right? And after that, you keep asking and you keep asking until something happens. Well, when we continue on with this, she's going to show her persistence. She's even going to fall down, in Matthew's account, fall down and worship at Jesus' feet. Well, she's trying to get the point across, both of her faith, but also of her need. She is desperate, and she needs Christ to help her. But the result of this, in Matthew's account, in chapter 15, verse 23, Matthew says of his disciples, of Jesus' disciples, that they were starting to get annoyed with her. Now, this isn't the only time that happens, right? It colors them in pretty bad light, but the two times that we have that the disciples get annoyed when someone's talking to Jesus, it's a woman who's in need because her daughter's demon-possessed, and then when there's too many children coming to them. That doesn't look great on the disciples, but that's what they do. So, they do get annoyed. They want him to send her away. They think that she's just causing a distraction, and they can, maybe in their defense, they can see the stress that's on their master. Maybe they recognize that he does need some space, some time away from the crowds that are always gathered about him. Even still, he hasn't commanded them to treat her this way. And so we'll see Jesus' response instead of his disciples. Now in Matthew's account, in chapter 15, verse 23, initially when she speaks to him, his response is nothing. His response is silence. And so that's kind of strange right from the start. And there's, of course, in this story, a lot of questions that people have about the way in which Christ responds to this mother, the way that he interacts with her. And we'll try to address those briefly. But again, he starts out without responding at all. Now the next thing he does, and so this is Matthew again here, Matthew 15 and verse 24. And this is left out of Mark's account, and this is probably the most important part to add back in. In verse 24, Jesus says, he answered and said, now be clear here, verse 23, his disciples have just said, send her away, for she cries out after us. And then he responds to who? To his disciples. So he doesn't say this to the woman, he's actually saying this to his disciples, but he says, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay. So Jesus' initial response is not to the woman, actually, but instead to his own disciples, and he says, I know you want me to send her away, and almost agreeing with you, not to send her away, but it's not my responsibility. I was sent not to her, but I was sent to the Jews. Okay? Well, let's continue on with that, but keep that in mind as we go forward. Because the next thing that's said, both in Matthew and in Mark chapter 7, verse 27, he says, let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. Now Matthew 15 in verse 26, very similarly recorded, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. Now, in both cases, the word for good can be translated a lot of ways. In the King James, it was translated as meat, which reminds me that the way you can also translate that, just like a help meet, is someone that's suitable for the other. Well, in this case, that's what we mean. It's not suitable. It's not proper for someone to do this action. Now, the action he's talking about is to take the food that the master has and give it to the dogs rather than the children. So when we hear the word dogs, we almost immediately get offended. We almost immediately take this as being rude or offensive. And so we have to talk about that just a little bit. Now, it is true that dogs can be offensive, and it is used offensively in the New Testament as well. So that's certainly true. The other thing that we need to understand as being true is that Jesus is making a distinction. He is, and he's making a distinction between the Jews and those who are not Jewish here. The distinction is that the Jews are being equated to the children of the master, and that the Gentiles are being equated to in this case, the little dogs that eat under the table. Okay? There is a real distinction. So whatever we come away understanding from this, we have to know that first. So is Jesus being offensive here? The better question, is Jesus being rude to this woman? No, he's not, because he is Christ. We do presuppose correctly that Christ cannot behave in an un-Christ-like manner. He cannot be rude in the way that we're thinking of being rude here. And so what does he mean, though? Well, we'll say a couple of ideas that people have had, if he does have some kind of tone when he speaks here, that maybe what he's doing is he's adopting the tone or the prejudice of his own disciples. And he's kind of mirroring that. And if he's doing that, it would be for their benefit to end up making a point about it. But maybe he's going along with that just for a moment in order to teach his own apostles. That's possible. A lot of people will point out the difference in the word that's used here versus the other times that dog is used in the New Testament. The word here is translated as little dog, which is appropriate, and so some people have even equated that to puppy. Maybe, maybe not. I do know for the Greek, the other word that's used, like in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 22, that a dog returns to its own vomit, that is a different word. It does mean something different. It can even just mean a hound or kind of a mutt like we would think. And so that's not the word used here. Maybe you make that distinction to say that this isn't offensive, but still, like we said, there is a distinction between the children and the little dogs. It could be that Jesus was testing her faith. It could be that he says this in order to have her be almost taken aback and see if that will drive her away or if she'll still be persistent even after that. It's possible. Or it's possible that this is not frustration, but just the recognition that we've had from the beginning that Christ is tired of being around the crowds, and that he, from a human perspective, is looking to get away just for a minute from all of that burden, and yet this woman won't leave him alone. And so he says, listen, It's not appropriate that this happens right now, okay? And so it could be something along those lines. Whatever of those understandings we take, it doesn't necessarily make it rude or offensive. Now, let me go a little bit farther with this, because those are the explanations you'll usually hear. One, what he's really doing, if we understand this and put the text together, he's not saying anything different, we'll say in Matthew's account, he's not saying anything different in verse 26 than he did in verse 24. In verse 24 he says, I was not sent except to the house of Israel, to the lost of that house. Okay? When he gets to verse 26, he says it again. He just says it in a short parable. He says, listen, it's not right for me to give the food to you because I was sent to Israel, which is what I've already said. If that's all it is, then that would make sense. But let me take that a step farther. Because like I said, verse 26, or verse 27 if you're in Mark, it really is a parable. It's just a very short one, and we're used to Jesus' parables taking up a little bit more room, but what if it did? What if Jesus went beyond this and kind of gave the full story? I don't know that we would have as many questions about it. So let me give you, if I can, this is Isaac's parable based off of Jesus' words here. But if this full statement were made, as is the intention, it would seem, of what Jesus is saying, then would we be as confused? So here's the parable. The kingdom of heaven is like this. Behold, there were two masters, and a famine came over the land, such that there was little food. Both masters went to feed their households. The first master fed his children, and then let his pets eat the leftovers. The second fed his pets first, and then gave his children the leftovers. Which man acted righteously? And so the Son of Man has come first to the Jews and later to the Gentiles. That's my assessment of what Christ is saying here. But again, if he had gone through this whole parable, rather than just giving us a little glimpse of what that parable would look like in these terms, would we really question it? Or is all Christ saying is, this isn't appropriate? What's appropriate, as anybody would know, is that you feed the children first, because they're of greater importance, at least in this timetable that Christ is talking about. And then others can eat after that has taken place. So, however we understand that, he's really not going beyond his normal teaching. In fact, you look back in Matthew chapter 7 and in verse 6, and what Christ says there, as you'll probably remember, is that you do not give what is holy to the dogs. And you don't cast pearls before swine. It's the same thing that he's already taught, and he's using the same analogy here. He's using the same parable here, but maybe because it's as brief as it is, we don't understand it as fully as we ought to. Regardless, what he means is that the blessings that he has, his ministry as well, those things aren't for the Gentiles while he's on earth. Others will come later. They will help to teach the Gentiles. His death and all the blessings that come from it are for all people, just not quite right now. And so when we see Christ saying that your time has not yet come, it doesn't make him hateful, it doesn't make him offensive, it doesn't make him rude. It's just a little bit of correction. But in spite of this, she's still going to persuade him, right? And all it takes for her to persuade him is this one sentence, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs. In both cases, in Matthew, Christ responds and says, great is your faith. And in Mark, it says, for this saying, what you've requested will be done. So the positive response both ways comes from this one statement that Christ makes. Now, what do we need to take away from this story? First, let's ask this question. Why were these words from this mother this effective on Christ? Why did they change his mind, it would almost seem, and persuade him to do this? Well, because what she's doing is she's not talking back to Christ, and she's not trying to circumvent what he's just said. Instead, what she's trying to do is show quite a bit of humility, which we'll talk more about. But essentially what she says to Christ, when he says that it's not appropriate for the master to give the food to the dogs instead of the children, she says two things. She says, one, I know I'm not looking for a full meal. I just need the crumbs for right now. Do you hear the humility in that? Do you recognize what it takes for you to say, I know that I don't deserve the whole thing, but if you can give me just the tiniest piece right now, not for my own sake, but for my daughter's, then it would change everything in my life. And the second thing, as much as we get hung up on this phrase of little dog and thinking that that may be offensive, did she take it as offensive? Or did she do something else with it? Something else that's hard to do without perfect humility, which is to say, yeah, that's me. When it comes to our situation with Christ, I don't know how we always respond, but isn't this the appropriate response to say, God, I don't deserve it. I don't even deserve the crumbs that fall from the table, but if you'll give me just the tiniest bit of your grace, I recognize myself as being unworthy, but just the smallest bit of your grace will make all the difference. What makes her a good mother in this story? One, she seeks out help. Of course, no one can do any of this alone, and certainly she recognizes that, but more importantly, she seeks out help from Christ. Christ is the ultimate source of help. She also trusts in Christ, so not just that he could help, but that he will help, that he's able to help, and she doesn't give up. In this story, like we've talked about, we ask the question, well, what would you do if you were in this position? If your child were suffering, if they were in pain, if they were ill in whatever way, what would you not do for them? Well, let's make that question a little bit more difficult and a lot more spiritual and ask the question, how often does it happen that parents, this doesn't have to be the mother's responsibility, and it's not the mother's responsibility, it's the parents, but how often do parents let their children, how often do they watch them just not progressing as a Christian, never growing? What if your child wasn't growing physically? What doctor would you not find to take them to? And yet, how often do we let children sit in the pew week by week, and maybe they're doing well in school, and maybe everything else is good in their life, but in Christ, you don't see any growth. You overlook it, you ignore it. What would you not do? And the same thing here, if you see your child struggling and slipping away from Christ and from the church, what would you not do? Now, ultimately, of course, the decision is not yours to make. That's the difficult part of it. But when it comes to children, and especially their eternal safety, what are we not willing to do that we might be willing to do if the problem were more obvious and more physical right in front of us, instead of a slow spiritual drift farther and farther from God? Now, that's the negative side of this, and it is very negative. What's the positive side? This story teaches something more important than anything else for mothers, especially mothers, as many of you are, and as many of you know, mothers that do have children, that are not in the church, that are drifting away from God. What about those mothers? What this story says is that Christ has compassion on those mothers. That Christ hears the prayers of those mothers. That Christ hears when they repeat again and again the same prayer for the same child that's in the same need as last time. That Christ cares for them. And so, of course, keep on praying. This morning, the message is simple enough. We've taken a look at an individual who is a mother, but one that encounters Christ and the response that she has as that takes place and the faith that she shows. And so the message is to be like this individual in the ways that she shows faith, in the ways that she comes to Christ. This morning, not just if you're a mother, but this morning, for all who are here, God's invitation is open to you to grow as an individual, to grow as a Christian in Christ, or to come to Christ for the first time or for the 100th time, whatever the need may be. If you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.